Welcome to Shadows of Black History. Before we begin tonight, take a moment to tell us in the comments section where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the hour that surrounds you right now. If you have not yet subscribed, do so before the story reaches its first turning point, because what you are about to hear is the kind of history that official textbooks buried beneath layers of deliberate silence. Turn off every distraction, settle your mind into stillness, and pay close attention, because the story of Caesar of the Carolinas, the enslaved man who mastered the language of death and used it to rewrite the rules of a world that refused to see him as human, is not a story you can afford to miss a single word of. There is a particular kind of power that emerges only from the deepest suffering, not the power of armies or governments or gold, not the power of kings seated comfortably behind palace walls, the kind of power that rises from the ground like smoke, from a fire that was never supposed to burn in the first place. It is a power born in chains, sharpened by humiliation, and finally unleashed when the world least expects it. In the humid lowlands of colonial South Carolina during the early decades of the 18th century, a man emerged from that kind of suffering who would become one of the most feared and misunderstood figures in the buried annals of Black American history. His name was Caesar, not the Roman conqueror whose glory fills school curricula, not any Caesar that scholars celebrate in marble halls. This Caesar was an enslaved African man, dragged across an ocean against his will, stripped of his name, his language, and his humanity by a colonial system that reduced him to property, to muscle, to a tool that could be discarded when it had served its purpose. And yet, within the very system that tried to destroy him, Caesar found a doorway into power. He did not kick the door open with rage. He did not announce his intentions with fire and fury. He walked through that doorway with quiet intelligence, cold patience, and a plan so carefully constructed that even now, 3 centuries later, the full weight of what he did has never been properly told. History whispered his name and then quickly changed the subject. Because the truth of what Caesar accomplished challenges the comfortable story that the powerful have always preferred to tell. This is not a comfortable story, it is a necessary one. To understand Caesar, you must first understand the world that made him. By the early 1700s, the colony of South Carolina had developed into one of the most brutal slaveholding societies in the entire history of the Atlantic world. This is not hyperbole. Historians who have spent their careers studying the era describe the Carolina Lowcountry during this period as a place where the machinery of racial terror operated with a precision and legal sophistication that would influence every slave state that came after it. The colony's economy rested almost entirely on rice cultivation. Rice required flooded fields, endless physical labor, and workers who possessed deep agricultural knowledge that the European colonizers themselves did not have. It was enslaved Africans, many of them taken specifically from the rice-growing regions of West Africa, from Senegambia, from Sierra Leone, from the Gold Coast, who brought that knowledge with them across the Middle Passage and deposited it into soil they did not own, for masters they did not choose, in a land that had already erased their names. By 1720, enslaved Africans outnumbered white colonists in South Carolina by a ratio of nearly 2-to-1. The colonists knew this, they were afraid. And when powerful men are afraid, they build systems of control. The colony enacted the Negro Act of 1696, a comprehensive legal code designed to govern, restrict, punish, and terrorize the enslaved population into complete submission. Patrols rode through the night. Passes were required for movement. The punishment for resistance was not merely death. It was public, spectacular, deliberately theatrical death, designed to make an example so horrifying that no one who witnessed it would ever consider defiance again. Into this world, Caesar was born. Or more precisely, into this world, Caesar was delivered against every instinct of human dignity, across an ocean he never asked to cross, wearing chains he never agreed to wear. No record tells us the name his mother gave him. No archive preserves the language of his childhood prayers. What history preserved, barely and reluctantly, is what he became. Caesar arrived in the Carolinas the way most enslaved Africans arrived, as cargo, as numbers recorded in a ledger, as bodies evaluated for strength by men whose eyes moved across human beings the way a buyer examines livestock at a market. He was assigned to a rice plantation south of Charlestown, the colonial capital, on land so flat and wet that the horizon shimmered with a kind of false promise. Everywhere the eye could reach, there was green abundance. And beneath that abundance, invisible to those who did not know where to look, There was a system of suffering so complete that it reached into every waking hour of every enslaved person's life. Caesar's first years on the plantation were defined by what they were for all enslaved people in that era. Exhaustion so deep it became its own kind of illness. Mosquitoes that carried malaria from the flooded fields into the lungs and blood of workers who had no choice but to keep moving, keep bending, keep laboring. Overseers who moved through the rows of workers with whips held loosely in their hands, as if the whip were simply an extension of the arm as natural as breathing. Punishments administered publicly, in the open fields, in front of other workers, because fear shared becomes fear multiplied. Caesar watched all of it. He remembered all of it. The particular cruelty of a man named Hartwell, who served as the plantation's chief overseer and who was known among the enslaved community for the variety of his methods. Hartwell did not merely punish the body, he punished the spirit. He would separate men from women who had formed bonds, for no reason other than to demonstrate his power over connection itself. He would destroy small objects that enslaved people had made or collected, objects that carried meaning, that represented the fragile edges of an interior life that slavery tried to dismantle entirely. Caesar filed every memory like documents in an archive. The day Hartwell used a branding iron on an old man who moved too slowly through the field rows. The morning a woman was beaten for protecting her child from the overseer's boot. The afternoon a young man, no older than 17, was dragged to the edge of the tree line and never seen again. The story given to his family was that he had run. Caesar knew from the look in Hartwell's eyes afterward that it was not true. He did not speak about what he knew. He did not organize a visible resistance. He did not whisper to others in the desperate, reckless way that got men killed. What Caesar did instead was something that his captors never anticipated, because they had never taken the time to understand the depth of the mind they had enslaved. He learned. Caesar understood from very early in his captivity that survival in the colonial world required a particular kind of intelligence, not the performance of intelligence, which would only draw suspicion, the concealment of intelligence, which allowed a man to observe everything while appearing to see nothing. He watched the way the plantation's white population moved through their days. He studied their systems. He noted which paths were traveled most frequently and which were forgotten. He learned the schedules of the night patrols, not by asking questions that would raise suspicion, but by sleeping lightly and listening to the rhythms of the world outside the quarters where enslaved people were confined. He learned the rotation of the guards at the supply houses. He learned who among the white employees drank too heavily after sunset, and which among them remained sharp-eyed and unpredictable. He memorized faces. He memorized habits. He built, in the private architecture of his mind, a map of the plantation's vulnerabilities that no official document would ever record. But Caesar's education went deeper than surveillance. He had been assigned, partly by accident and partly by a calculation that would later prove catastrophically mistaken, to a role that gave him access to something extraordinary. The plantation's owner, a man named Culberson, who had prospered enormously through rice and through the sale of enslaved people, employed a physician who visited the estate roughly once each month to attend to the medical needs of both white family members and enslaved workers, the latter because sick workers produced less and were valuable property. This physician, a man named Dr. Archibald Crane, was old enough to believe that knowledge had no color. He was not kind in any way that would survive moral scrutiny today. He did not challenge the system that surrounded him. But he was a practical man with a respect for competence, and he noticed something in Caesar during his earliest visits. The young enslaved man showed an unusual ability to remember information, to ask questions that revealed he had been listening carefully during previous conversations, and to apply knowledge quickly once it was demonstrated to him. Dr. Crane began, almost experimentally at first, to explain his work as he performed it. Which plants held medicinal properties, which roots could reduce fever, which compounds, when combined, could ease pain or induce sleep, which substances, when administered incorrectly, could do the opposite of healing. Caesar absorbed every word. He asked no unnecessary questions. He showed no excitement. But in the silence of his quarters, night after night, he organized what he learned into a careful system of knowledge that grew more complex and more powerful with each passing month. He was building something, and no one around him had any idea what it was. The event that transformed Caesar from a man quietly preparing into a man actively moving came without announcement. It came the way all irreversible moments come, as a single act of cruelty so specific and so personal that it reaches past the accumulated weight of everything that came before and strikes something that had, until that moment, remained protected. A woman named Nana, who had become in every way that mattered the closest thing to family that Caesar had known since being taken from Africa, was called before Hartwell on a January morning for a violation so minor that to state it aloud almost refuses to be believed. She had sung during the previous evening's hours a song in her original language, quiet and low, within the walls of the quarters, audible to no one outside. One of the plantation's younger overseers, ambitious and eager to demonstrate his authority, had pressed his ear to the wall of the building and heard the foreign syllables and decided, for reasons that are as revealing about the psychology of his world as any document from the era, that the song was a signal of conspiracy. Hartwell did not investigate the claim. He did not ask Caesar, who was known to work near Nana, whether anything suspicious had occurred. Hartwell simply believed what he wished to believe, which was that control required demonstration and that demonstration required a subject. Caesar stood in the yard and watched what followed. He stood completely still, his breathing remained controlled, his face revealed nothing. And in the interior of his mind, something that had been building for years reached completion with a finality so absolute that afterward, Caesar later told the man who eventually wrote down fragments of his story, he felt almost peaceful, because he knew exactly what he was going to do. He had always known, somewhere in the landscape of his deeper intentions, that a moment would come when planning would give way to action. He had not known when. He had not known the exact shape it would take. He knew now. That night, Caesar sat by the window of his quarters as the moon moved across the Carolina sky, and he began to think through each step of a plan that had been assembling itself in the background of his mind for 3 years. He was not thinking about anger. Anger was too small a word for what he carried. He was thinking about architecture, the architecture of consequence, the structure of a justice that the colony's official justice system would never deliver. What distinguished Caesar from many who had attempted various forms of resistance before him was a quality that the men he intended to target would never have credited, him with possessing strategic patience. He understood something that his enemies, comfortable in their certainty of his ignorance, had never been forced to learn. That the most dangerous form of power is not the power that announces itself. It is the power that waits and watches and chooses its moment with the precision of a man who has calculated every possible outcome and eliminated every avenue of escape for the man he intends to bring down. Caesar's plan had 3 components, and he began executing the first of them within weeks of the night he committed himself entirely to its completion. The first component was trust, not genuine trust, which was neither offered nor available in the world he inhabited. Manufactured trust, which is a different and more demanding thing. To manufacture trust in the eyes of men who already believed they controlled him entirely, Caesar needed to become the most visible version of what they expected an enslaved man to be: obedient, useful, grateful for whatever scraps of comfort his position provided. He worked harder. He presented himself as eager to demonstrate competence. He volunteered for tasks that required him to move more freely through the plantation's grounds. He accepted Hartwell's corrections with a bowed head and a face that showed nothing but compliance. Hartwell observed this performance and drew from it exactly the conclusion Caesar intended. He noted to the plantation's owner that the African named Caesar had settled well into his position and showed no signs of the dangerous temperament that plagued newer arrivals. The owner, who was dealing with administrative concerns at his other properties, accepted this assessment without scrutiny. Caesar was assigned greater responsibilities. He was trusted with keys to the storage buildings where the physician's medical supplies were kept. This was the second component of his plan made real. Dr. Crane had taught Caesar about the properties of certain plants that grew in the wetlands surrounding the plantation. Among them was a species that produced, when its root was properly prepared, a compound that was nearly odorless, nearly tasteless, and capable of producing effects that moved slowly enough to appear, to any observer without specific medical knowledge, as natural illness. Caesar had been gathering and preparing these materials for months, storing them in a manner so inconspicuous that they appeared to be merely scraps of plant matter accumulated by a man who worked near the wetlands. The physician had given him enough knowledge, without understanding that he had done so, to transform those plants into something precise and controlled. The third component of Caesar's plan was sequence. He did not intend to act in rage, striking wildly at the first opportunity. He intended to move through a deliberate order, beginning with those whose absence would cause the least immediate investigation, and proceeding carefully toward those who carried the most responsibility for the suffering he had witnessed. The first name on Caesar's private list was not Hartwell. It was not even the overseer who had reported Nana's song. The first name belonged to a man who held no official title and no formal authority, but who had built, over years of proximity to power, a particular kind of influence that made him more dangerous than those above him. His name was Pryor, and he was a collaborator. Pryor was an enslaved man who had made a calculation that some men make when they discover that the system willing to destroy them might also be willing to reward them, provided they make themselves useful to its machinery. He had positioned himself as an informant, reporting whispered conversations and observed behaviors to the plantation's overseers in exchange for small protections and privileges that most enslaved people never received. He ate better. He was assigned to lighter work. He was allowed a measure of movement and comfort that functioned in the compressed moral geography of the plantation as a form of currency. Caesar understood Pryor not with contempt, because contempt is too simple a response to complexity. He understood him with the cold clarity of a man who recognizes that systems of oppression do not require only external enforcers. They require internal ones. The most efficient terror is the terror that makes its subjects participate in their own surveillance. Pryor had provided information that led to the punishment of at least 4 men that Caesar knew of personally. He had confirmed the suspicion that led to the disappearance of the young man near the tree line. He was not a villain in the theatrical sense of the word. He was something more troubling, a person reshaped by a system into its own instrument of perpetuation. Caesar watched Pryor for 2 weeks before he moved. He observed that Pryor kept a small supply of food hidden beneath a loose plank in the corner of the shared quarters, food taken from the main house in small quantities over time. This detail was important not because the food itself mattered, but because it told Caesar something about Pryor's psychology. The man was afraid. Despite his privileges, despite his arrangement with the overseers, he understood on some level that his position was precarious. He was storing resources the way a man does when he suspects that the ground beneath him is not as solid as it appears. Caesar used that fear. He began leaving small objects near Pryor's sleeping area, objects that carried no obvious meaning but that appeared deliberate. A single flower petal pressed under the edge of his blanket. A piece of cord tied in a particular knot placed beside the hidden food. He did this over several nights, varying the objects just enough to prevent Pryor from constructing a rational explanation for them. Pryor began sleeping poorly. He began watching the other men in the quarters with an anxiety that had not been there before. He was rattled in the way that a man is rattled when he cannot identify a threat, but knows one exists. On the 8th night, Caesar added a small preparation, drawn from the compounds he had assembled from the wetland plants, to the water stored near Pryor's usual drinking vessel. Not enough to kill, enough to induce a severe illness, one that would appear to be the malaria that moved through the Carolina lowlands like a perpetual shadow, taking lives with such regularity that individual cases rarely drew sustained investigation. Pryor was ill within 2 days. He died within 8. The physician examined the body and noted what he had noted in so many previous deaths: fever, organ weakness. The colony consumed its enslaved workers at such a rate that individual deaths were rarely examined with the attention that might reveal something irregular. Pryor was buried without ceremony. The overseers noted the loss of a useful informant and then moved on to their other concerns. Caesar attended the brief service, as was expected of those who lived in the same quarters. His face was calm. Inside his mind, he crossed the first name from his list and turned his attention to the second. If Pryor represented the human machinery that systems of oppression construct from their own victims, then Hartwell represented the ideological core of such systems. He was not merely a man who followed orders. He was a man who believed in the orders. He moved through his role as chief overseer with the conviction of someone who understood his cruelty as a form of order, as necessary, as civilizing, as the application of a structure that kept chaos at bay. This conviction made him predictable. And predictability, Caesar had learned, is the most reliable form of vulnerability. Hartwell was fastidious in his habits. He ate the same foods on the same days of the week. He walked his inspection of the outer fields in the same pattern each morning, beginning at the southeastern corner of the rice paddies and moving clockwise around the perimeter before entering the center rows. He retired to his residence each evening at a specific hour. He kept a wooden cabinet in his office that contained his personal liquor supply, and he poured himself a measure from that cabinet each evening before beginning his paperwork. Caesar had observed this routine so precisely and for so long that he could have moved through it blindfolded. The challenge with Hartwell was that he was not easily isolated. Unlike Pryor, who moved through the plantation with the casual confidence of someone who believed his arrangement with the overseers protected him, Hartwell rarely placed himself in situations of vulnerability. He was surrounded during the day. His residence had a lock on the door. He was not a man who drank until he became careless. Caesar needed to reach the liquor cabinet. This required a form of access that would not be granted through ordinary means. But Caesar had spent months building the trust of the plantation's owner and the senior overseers, and he had become, through careful demonstration of competence and absolute compliance, one of the few enslaved men permitted to enter the administrative buildings for cleaning and maintenance purposes. One afternoon, while performing his assigned maintenance of the hallway immediately outside Hartwell's office, Caesar was alone for 11 minutes. He had timed this possibility carefully over weeks of observation, noting that a specific configuration of afternoon activities reliably produced this window. 11 minutes was enough. He moved through Hartwell's office with a certainty that came from having rehearsed it in his mind so many times that the movements required no deliberate thought. He opened the liquor cabinet, removed the bottle that Hartwell used most frequently, added a preparation he had kept concealed in a small cloth folded inside his clothing, replaced the bottle, closed the cabinet, and returned to the hallway before the 11 minutes had elapsed. He was cleaning the hallway floor when Hartwell returned. Hartwell glanced at him without particular attention and passed into his office. That evening, as every evening, Hartwell poured himself a measure from the cabinet. He fell ill within 3 days. The progression was slower than it had been with Pryor, because Caesar had adjusted the quantity carefully based on what Dr. Crane had taught him about body weight and metabolic variation. Hartwell lasted 11 days before his body finally surrendered. The physician attended him throughout and noted in his records that the overseer had died of a fever of unknown origin, likely acquired during his regular inspection of the flooded fields where illness moved freely. The plantation mourned Hartwell in the way that institutions mourn administrators. Briefly, with concern about replacement rather than grief for the person. The enslaved community buried their reaction with the discipline that years of captivity had enforced. But Caesar, moving through his work as though nothing had changed, heard the quality of the silence among the other workers in the days following Hartwell's death, and in that silence he heard something that he had not heard in a long time. The faint, almost imperceptible sound of a collective exhale. The deaths of Pryor and Hartwell had not yet drawn the colony's attention. Pryor was an enslaved man, and enslaved people died constantly, and were recorded as such without serious investigation. Hartwell's death was mourned more formally, but fevers in the Low Country were so common that no serious suspicion attached itself to his passing. Caesar was now operating in a space that required him to adjust his thinking. He had begun with specific personal targets, men whose particular cruelties he had witnessed and stored. But the act of moving through his plan had changed something in his understanding of what he was doing, and why. His original motivation had been rooted in the specific faces, the specific acts, the specific debts that a system of oppression accumulates over years of individual cruelty. But as the silence following Hartwell's death moved through the plantation, Caesar observed something he had not anticipated. The other overseers, who had not yet connected the two deaths, were nonetheless nervous. Unexplained deaths in the environment they controlled produced an anxiety that was visible in small ways. Raised voices, increased patrols, a tightening of routines that, in the absence of an identified threat, produced only the appearance of control without the substance of it. And in the spaces created by that anxiety, something was shifting among the enslaved population. The invisible sociology of people who have lived under total control is extraordinarily sensitive to changes in the behavior of those who control them. The enslaved workers on the plantation noticed the nervousness. They did not understand its source, but they responded to it with a subtle recalibration, a fractional expansion of their own interior freedom, the kind that has no visible form, but that changes the quality of a person's life in ways that matter enormously when almost everything else has been taken. Caesar recognized that his actions had produced a consequence beyond their immediate targets. He had not intended to become a symbol. He had intended to deliver justice to specific men for specific acts, but justice, once it moves through a community, does not stay contained within the boundaries of its original intention. He spent a long night considering what this meant for his choices going forward, and he concluded something that would define the remaining course of his actions. He could not stop at the personal. Not now. Not when the system that had authorized every cruelty he had witnessed was still intact, still producing new versions of Hartwell and Pryor, and every other instrument of suffering it required. He turned his attention upward in the hierarchy of colonial authority, toward the men who did not get their hands dirty because they had others to do it for them, but whose decisions created the conditions in which dirty hands were always available and always willing. Charlestown in the early 18th century was, by the measure of the Atlantic slave trade, one of the most active ports in the Americas. Ships arrived regularly carrying human cargo from West Africa, and the men who organized, financed, and profited from this trade were not shadowy criminals. They were respected members of colonial society. They attended church. They were appointed to civic positions. They were, by every visible measure of their world, pillars of the community they were helping to build on a foundation of purchased human beings. One such man, a merchant and slave trader named Aldous Venn, had his business interests entangled with the plantation where Caesar worked. Venn supplied enslaved workers to the plantation and several others in the region, and he visited periodically to conduct the transactions that, in the language of his ledgers, involved the transfer of human beings at agreed prices. He was a tall man who dressed expensively and spoke with the deliberate slowness of someone who had learned that wealthy men need not rush their words. He arrived at the plantation on a quarterly basis, reviewed the working population, negotiated with the owner, and departed, having left behind new arrivals and, sometimes, having taken others whose removal served his commercial calculations. Caesar had first seen Venn during his second year on the plantation, when Venn arrived to complete a transaction involving a group of men from a neighboring estate who were being redistributed based on the owner's decision to reduce his workforce. Caesar watched Venn move through this transaction with the precise, unemotional efficiency of a man, reviewing inventory, and understood with the quiet force of certainty that this man represented something different from the overseers and informants he had already addressed. Venn did not operate at the level of individual cruelty. He operated at the level of system design. He was, in the clearest sense of the term, one of the architects. Reaching Venn presented challenges of an entirely different category from those Caesar had navigated before. Venn did not live on the plantation. He moved through Charlestown and the surrounding region with the freedom of a prosperous man, surrounded by the protections that wealth and social standing provided. He was not isolated. He was not careless. He was not drunk on power in the way that overseers were drunk on it. But wealthy men have a particular kind of vulnerability that their wealth manufactures for them. They dine in specific establishments at specific hours. They conduct their business in predictable locations. They travel with the confidence of men who believe the world has been organized for their convenience. And that confidence contains within it a blindness, because men who believe the world has been designed for their comfort rarely consider the possibility that the world might also contain a force moving specifically against them. Caesar created a situation that required Venn's presence on the plantation at a time that Caesar had engineered. He did this through a chain of small actions, each innocuous on its own, that resulted in the owner sending a message to Venn requesting his presence for an inventory review. Caesar had learned enough about the plantation's commercial operations during his period of expanded access to understand which levers, when pushed gently, would produce the outcomes he needed. Venn arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring. Caesar was among the workers assigned to unload the merchant's wagon. This gave him physical proximity, confirmed details about Venn's routines that he had gathered from secondary observation, and allowed him to place in the stored cargo that Venn would transport back to Charlestown, a preparation carefully sealed inside a container of preserved fruit that the merchant had brought as a gift for the plantation owner and was taking back, partially consumed, as was his habit. Venn was accustomed to eating from this supply during his return journey. He fell ill 2 weeks after returning to Charlestown. The illness progressed in the pattern that Caesar had refined through his earlier executions. The physician who attended Venn was more thorough than the plantation's doctor, and he noted in his records certain symptoms that he found unusual. But the Carolina Low Country was a place where unusual illnesses were common, and Venn was an older man whose constitution was not robust, and the physician ultimately attributed the death to the general fever season. Venn was mourned by the city's merchant class as the passing of a productive member of their community. His death was briefly noticed in the colonial records. It was not connected to the deaths on the plantation, not yet. By the time suspicion began to move toward Caesar, it did so in the way that real suspicion moves, not with the dramatic suddenness of accusation, but with the quiet gathering of observations that no single person has yet assembled into a complete picture. The plantation's new overseer, a man named Duval who had arrived from the Virginia colony and brought with him a colder and more analytical disposition than his predecessor, began keeping records of a type that Hartwell had never maintained. He noted dates. He noted the locations of workers during specific periods. He noted patterns. Duval had been on the plantation for 6 weeks when he began to notice that several of the deaths that had occurred during the previous year, deaths he had inherited in his administrative records as closed matters, shared a characteristic that had never been formally observed. The people who had died had all, at some point in the period preceding their illness, had contact with Caesar in contexts that involved food, liquid, or stored materials. Duval did not immediately conclude anything from this observation. He was a methodical man, and methodical men require more than pattern recognition before they are willing to make an accusation. But he began watching Caesar with a precision that Caesar, who had grown accustomed to the inattentive surveillance of men who believed his submission was absolute, noticed immediately. The recognition, when it came, was physical. Caesar was crossing the storage yard one morning when he felt the quality of Duval's gaze land on him with a weight that was different from the ordinary oversight he had learned to navigate. It was the gaze of a man who was assembling something. Caesar adjusted instantly, and without any visible sign of adjustment. He continued his work with the same rhythm, the same pace, the same angle of the head that communicated obedient absorption in the task. But behind the performance he was calculating. He estimated, a narrow window before Duval's accumulating observations crossed the threshold from suspicion to accusation. And in the colonial world, accusation required no proof to produce consequences. The accused did not receive a trial in any meaningful sense. Evidence was a formality at best. He needed to either remove Duval from the equation or exit the situation entirely. Both options carried their own terrible risks. Removing Duval would add the most dangerous item possible to the pattern the man was already assembling, because if the new overseer died shortly after beginning to watch Caesar closely, even the most casual observer would eventually connect the circumstances. Exiting the situation entirely meant running, and running in colonial South Carolina was a choice that ended badly for the overwhelming majority of those who attempted it. The patrols were organized. The landscape was difficult. The legal consequences for those who were caught and returned were designed to be severe enough to function as deterrents. Caesar spent 3 nights working through these competing risks with the same systematic attention he had given to his original plan. And on the 3rd night, he arrived at a conclusion that reflected something that had grown in him over the course of his long and careful campaign. He was not running from Duval. He was going to outmaneuver him. What Caesar did next demonstrated a quality that separates men who are merely dangerous from men who are genuinely extraordinary. He walked directly into the danger. He went to Duval, not with the body language of a man who had been summoned, with the body language of a man who had come to report something important. He waited at the entrance to the overseer's office during the appropriate hour, hat in hand, and when Duval acknowledged him, Caesar reported with precise detail and perfect calm that he had noticed something in the supply storage that seemed to him, based on what the doctor had taught him about plant-based illness, potentially concerning. He described specific materials stored improperly, materials that could, when decomposed in the Carolina heat, produce substances harmful to those who handled them. He was, in essence, creating a narrative about the deaths that pointed away from himself and toward an environmental explanation while simultaneously establishing himself as the person who had identified the danger and reported it responsibly. Duval listened. He did not trust Caesar, but he was a practical man who understood that his own survival depended on maintaining the health and productivity of the plantation's workforce. He ordered an inspection of the storage areas that Caesar had identified. The physician was summoned. The materials Caesar had indicated were examined, and while the physician found nothing definitive, the process itself served Caesar's purpose precisely. It created a formal record of a potential alternative explanation for the deaths. It positioned Caesar as a cooperative participant in identifying the problem, and it temporarily shifted Duval's focused suspicion into a broader, more diffuse concern about the plantation's environmental conditions. The window that Caesar had identified as narrow opened slightly wider. He used it without hesitation. He had one more name remaining on the list he had never written down. The plantation's owner, Culberson himself, who bore ultimate responsibility for the system Caesar had endured, and for the specific choices that had authorized every act of cruelty committed on his property. But Culberson was both more powerful and more careful than any of Caesar's previous targets. He spent time at his other properties. He was attended by servants who had been with the family for years. He was not easily isolated, and Caesar, moving through his calculation of risks, understood something that he had been building toward without fully naming. He did not need to reach Culberson personally. He needed to use what he had built, the reputation, the trust, the position, to create a situation that would hold Culberson accountable without requiring Caesar to expose himself further. He had one final move. Caesar went to the physician. He told Dr. Crane that he had made an observation he felt compelled to share because it concerned the doctor's own professional standing. He explained, with the careful precision of a man who had learned the physician's language from the physician himself, that he believed the pattern of recent deaths on the plantation might reflect something systemic in the plantation's water supply or stored materials, and that if such a pattern were identified without the physician having raised the alarm, it could reflect badly on his professional care. He suggested that the physician document his own theory about the cause of the deaths and formally submit it to the colonial medical authorities as a precautionary professional record. The physician, who was indeed concerned about his standing and who found Caesar's analysis of the situation both alarming and, because of the competence Caesar had demonstrated over years, credible, did exactly what Caesar had suggested. He compiled a formal report attributing the recent deaths to environmental factors and submitted it to the Colonial Health Registry, which filed it and moved on to other matters. The paper existed, the explanation existed, the alternative narrative existed. Caesar had built an exit from the trap before the trap fully closed. The story of Caesar of the Carolinas does not end with a dramatic escape into the wilderness. It does not end with a speech delivered to an assembled audience or a military victory recorded in dispatches. It ends in a way that reflects the specific and difficult truth about what it meant to wage a campaign of resistance within a total system of control. Caesar eventually left the plantation. The records, such as they are, suggest he disappeared from the plantation's accounts within 2 years of Duval's arrival, at a time when the general disruption of the Stono Rebellion and its aftermath created a period of colonial anxiety during which record-keeping became inconsistent. Whether he escaped entirely, whether he was absorbed into one of the maroon communities that existed in the Carolina interior, whether he was recaptured and his story ended in a way the official records simply declined to record clearly because his value as an identified person was more useful than his truth, none of this is certain. What is certain is what his story reveals about the nature of resistance within systems of absolute power. Caesar understood something that the colonizers who designed the system never permitted themselves to consider, that the intelligence, the strategic capacity, the emotional and analytical sophistication required to survive within a system of total control does not disappear inside the person being controlled. It accumulates. It sharpens against the daily friction of oppression the way a blade sharpens against stone, and it waits, with a patience that comes from having no alternative, for the conditions in which it can be applied. The colonial world was designed around a single catastrophic miscalculation. It assumed that the people it enslaved were defined by their enslavement, that the chains, the laws, the patrols, the violence, and the deliberate assault on identity and culture had produced people whose inner lives matched the outer story the system told about them. People without ambition, without strategy, without a capacity for the kind of long-range planning that the colonizers attributed exclusively to themselves. Caesar's existence was a refutation of every element of that assumption. He was proof that oppression does not destroy the mind it targets, it transforms it. It strips away everything that was comfortable and safe and complacent and leaves behind a mind that has been forced into a clarity that comfort rarely produces. He did not fight the system with the weapons the system recognized. He did not organize a visible rebellion, although others did, and their courage is its own separate monument in the history of resistance. He fought the system with the tools the system had inadvertently provided to him, the medical knowledge, the physical access, the manufactured trust, the invisibility that his oppressors had constructed for themselves by refusing to see him as fully human. He turned their own blindness against them. 3 centuries after Caesar moved through the shadows of the Carolina lowlands, conducting his quiet and precise campaign of justice against the men who had authorized the destruction of everything he had once been, the questions his story raises are not historical in the comfortable sense of that word. They are not questions that belong to the past. They are questions about the present. What does it mean to survive inside a system that was designed to prevent your survival? What does it mean to resist when the ordinary forms of resistance are foreclosed by the overwhelming force of institutional power? What does the existence of Caesar tell us about the millions of others whose stories were not preserved, not even partially, in the archives of a world that was not interested in remembering them as strategists, as thinkers, as human beings navigating impossible circumstances with extraordinary intelligence? Every enslaved person who survived more than a season in the Carolina lowlands was making decisions with a sophistication that the historical record rarely acknowledges. Every woman who chose which words to speak and which to swallow was conducting a daily negotiation with power that required a quality of judgment most people in comfortable circumstances are never called upon to exercise. Every man who watched what Caesar watched and stored what Caesar stored and calculated what Caesar calculated was doing so without any certainty that his intelligence would ever produce an outcome other than the continuation of his suffering. The historical amnesia that surrounded Caesar and thousands of others like him was not accidental. It was engineered. The colonial world and the slave-holding society that followed it had powerful reasons to insist that the people it oppressed were the passive recipients of history rather than its active participants. Because the alternative, the truth, required a reckoning with the fact that the system operated against people who were fully human in every dimension that the word carries. People with inner lives, with strategic minds, with a capacity for moral reasoning that in many cases exceeded that of those who claimed authority over them. Caesar did not survive to tell his own story. Fragments that reached us came through other hands, filtered through other purposes, shaped by the priorities of people who were not him. This is the condition of most black history in the colonial Americas. The record exists only where the record keepers allowed it to exist, and the record keepers were rarely motivated by the preservation of truth. What we inherit from Caesar is not a complete story, it is a shadow, but shadows carry the shape of the thing that cast them. And the shape of Caesar, even in shadow form, even filtered through 3 centuries of deliberate forgetting, reveals something that cannot be erased, that he was here, that he thought, that he planned, that he acted, that he refused, at every level of his being, to accept the definition of himself that the world around him had constructed, that he looked at the men who held authority over his body, over his labor, over every hour of his days, and he did not see gods, he saw vulnerabilities, and he was right. You have just traveled through one of the most layered and deliberately hidden stories in the history of black resistance in the Americas. Stories like Caesar's were buried not by accident, but by design, because the truth of who these people were and what they were capable of challenges the foundational myths that systems of oppression require to sustain themselves. We bring these stories to light on Shadows of Black History because the past is not finished speaking. It speaks through every injustice that echoes from it. It speaks through every moment of quiet, unacknowledged resistance that continues to happen in every era when power meets the human refusal to be reduced. If this story moved you, if it opened something in you, if it made you reconsider what you thought you knew about this period and these people, then share it. Not just with people who already agree with you, but with people who have never heard these names, who have never been invited to consider that history's footnotes often contain more truth than its headlines. Leave us your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what part of Caesar's story stayed with you. Tell us what questions it raised for you. Tell us where you are in the world tonight, because this story belongs to every corner of the world that has ever been touched by what happened in those colonial wetlands. Subscribe to Shadows of Black History. Turn on your notifications, because we are only just beginning to pull back the curtain on the stories that were meant to stay hidden. The past does not die. It waits in the shadows, patient and precise, like the man at the center of the story you just heard. And here, on this channel, we will keep bringing it into the light. Until our next story, stay curious, stay awake. And remember, the most dangerous force in the world has never been the one that announces itself. It has always been the one that watches, learns, and waits.